All right guys, welcome back to the garage. Now, if you're new here, let me get you caught up. Now in the last video, we did this booster swap. It's from a late 80s, early 90s Dodge Daytona, which required the pin on the brake pedal to be relocated and the shaft actually extended on the booster. But that allowed us to ditch the factory booster for this much smaller one, which gives us room for an intake manifold, which the original plan was to use this 420A intake manifold, which now fits in here with the smaller booster, but it hits the thermostat housing, which I have another manifold on the way that I hope will work. We'll have to see. But the first video focused on getting the engine mounted in here so I can make engine mounts for both sides here, which required us to drop the steering rack. So that's the focus of today's video, is to get that steering rack mounted in its final location. That way I can rip the factory one out because I have to return it for a core for this new remand rack. Now, originally my plan was to run the SRT4 accessories, but the AC compressor came way back here and just gave no room for the steering, even with it dropped down there. And now the plan is to run the Stratus accessories, which is what this engine is from. It's from a 2003 Stratus. You can see it runs a much smaller AC compressor, which you can see it gives us a ton more room back here for the steering shaft to come through. So my plan was to use this plate, bolt it to the cross member there, bolt the rack to this plate just lower. But my dilemma is the thickness of this plate plus the bolt head is actually going to make this rack spaced out. And I don't really want to space it too far and give the tie rods too much of an angle back on either side. So I could just weld this to the cross member there, and that would eliminate at least the thickness of the bolt heads, and the rack could sit closer. But I really like the idea of a mechanical attachment to the cross member and not just welded. I'm trying to pick my brain on what I want to do. So let me think on it for a minute and I'll let you guys know what I come up with. All right, I'm kind of just playing around with the fitment, and one thing I'm running into is this little ear here on the compressor is kind of getting in my way. Now on the Stratus compressor, there's no bolt that goes there. There's actually just a locating pin on this side of the bracket. So I can cut that ear completely off, and that should give us some more room. All right, I think I got it sitting right where it's gonna live. Now, you can see I have it about as high as it can go to have plenty of room for the fittings. And I think I'm just gonna have to weld the plate. I really like how close it is. I don't wanna space the rack that way more for a bolt head to go through the plate. So I think I'm going to weld the plate to the cross member and then bolt the rack to the plate. Now the only thing I can see as being an issue is I might have to notch the cross member for when the bolt comes through to be able to put a nut there, because it looks like the bolt is going to go through cross member a little bit right there. So shouldn't be a big deal. Should be able to just notch it open right there for the nut. But I think that's the plan. So I'm going ahead and weld that up. Probably shorten it a little bit. I don't need it as quite as tall. And this does have a nice lip, which will be on the bottom side to keep it from flexing. And worst case, I can always run some supports from the back of the plate to the bottom of here. So it barely is going to hang lower than the frame. So hopefully we won't hit it on anything. You can see there's plenty of room up there where we notch the compressor. Plenty of space for the steering shaft to sit there. But that's the plan. So I'm going to take this down and go ahead and get this welded on there. All right, guys, I think we're finally done with the steering rack drop. There's a few more things we got to do, but for now, I think it's done. Couple things. I did run the bolts in from the back just because I didn't do enough clearance back there for a full nut. You can see I even tried to modify these by grinding down the flange, but it just worked out better to use the bolts on the backside. No big deal. I do need to get longer bolts and new nuts, especially because I want to run the factory washer on the front. So these aren't long enough. No big deal there. Then you can see we do have a tiny bit of air gap back there behind the rack, so it's not sitting against the plate. Same thing over there, air gap. And what I did was just run a stack of washers and just kept adding them until I got a nice air gap between the rack and the plate. That way I know the thickness of a spacer I need to get. And that turned out to be 3/4 of an inch, which happens to be the same size of the steering rack spacers you can find for Mustang 2 racks, which the Mustang 2 racks actually use the same size bushing. You can see here I have a set of offset bushings for a Mustang 2 manual rack. Because I wasn't sure how I was going to do it. I did end up using just energy suspension rack bushings for the Dakota. But if any of you guys needed to move your rack just 1/2 inch, these allow 1/2 inch of movement. So you could use the Mustang 2 rack bushings to move it up or down 1/2 inch. But those Mustang 2 rack spacers are the same size as the factory washer. So they're going to fit perfectly in there. It'll basically be just like this, except a solid piece of metal. So ordered those. That should work perfectly for the rack. I'll just have to run and get some longer bolts, new nuts. Then of course we're going to have to make a new steering shaft. You can see I got my one adapter on the rack. And then here's the one for the steering column. And as far as making a new steering shaft, it's just a matter of cutting this rod down the size. But you can see in my mess of parts, I have energy suspension body mounts. So I want to get those put on the cab before I make the rod, just because once we make it, it's one size. So it won't be able to move like the factory steering shaft. You can see the factory steering shaft actually has like a slip joint in there to allow this to move. And basically what that's for is flex between the cab and the steering shaft, since those two things are isolated by bushings. But I think once we have the polyurethane body mount bushings, it'll eliminate the cab from moving too much, and a solid shaft there should be fine. But like I said, I want to get those put in down there before I make my rod. But that's no big deal. We can make that anytime. But as far as the steering rack goes, I think it's done. I do have to do final welding around that plate. So far, all I did was tack it. And then I did do a couple plug welds up there. Tried to weld the subframe to this plate through some plug welds, just to try to make it a little safer. And tell me what you guys think. Should I make some braces that go from the frame to this plate back here? Try to brace it a little bit more. I am going to weld it up in here. And as far as the tie rod angle, they don't look too bad. They do have slight curve to the back. Nothing crazy. And that's only because we had to space the rack out from that plate. Stock, when that thing bolts in, it actually comes up top the frame right there. But now we are pushed back. So we have a little bit of angle. Not bad. Obviously, that's going to increase with the wheels turning, but hopefully it handles okay. And then as far as tie rod angle up and down, once this thing is down on the ground, we'll see how much of an angle the tie rods have. I do have Beltec 2-inch drop spindles, which I got for 87 to 90 trucks. Now let me explain why. I have a feeling that I'm going to have to run some kind of bump steer kit, just because we did lower the rack down. So once this thing is on the ground, you know, we might have some decent tie rod angle, but nobody makes a bump steer kit for that rack, or Dakotas anyway. So plan is to run a Mustang bump steer kit, which requires this to be drilled out to 5/8, which these early trucks had a smaller hole here for the tie rod end. And then the later trucks actually had a bigger hole here for the outer tie rod, which is bigger than 5/8. Now the bump steer kit for the Mustangs, the inner tie rod thread size on that kit is actually the same as the early first-gen Dakotas. The later first-gens had a bigger thread diameter. So those two things right there is why we can't use the Mustang bump steer kit with later spindles and later inner tie rods. But I'm pretty sure we can get early Dakota inners and they will bolt to this rack, which will allow us to use the bump steer kit for a Mustang with our early first-gen Beltec 2-inch drop spindles. So to recap, we have our steering rack. We'll have early first-gen Dakota inners, Mustang bump steer kit, and early first-gen Dakota Beltec drop spindles. All right, I know that was a lot of information, but I just wanted to go over the plan. Of course, we'll go over all that stuff again once we could do a final install of parts. But before we can do that, engine has to come back out so I can strip the suspension off, strip the frame, repaint the frame. We're going to repaint the firewall and all this in here. Basically what I want to do is have the frame cleaned all the way to maybe where the cab ends. So we'll have to undo the body mounts, lift this side of the cab, clean the frame, paint the frame, lower it down, do the other side. I have no way of actually lifting the cab off the frame, so that's just how I plan on doing it. That way we can get as much of this cleaned up as possible, because we're going to make a mess doing it. Wire wheeling and cleaning all this frame, all the rust off. And then the whole garage can get a final clean before we rebuild the engine. Because then once the engine's rebuilt, it can go back in here for good. But I think we'll end it off here. I really appreciate all you guys that are watching the videos. I know a lot of this is kind of boring, but we got to do this nonsense before we can get to the fun stuff. So when I started doing YouTube a little over a year ago, I was like, I wonder if I can hit 1,000 subscribers. And here we are, a little over a year, and we're over 5. So everybody who has subscribed over this past year, I really appreciate it. All you new guys that came for the Dakota stuff or the SRT4 stuff, welcome. I know there's tons of automotive YouTube content out there, a lot of big names. So if you chose to watch one of my videos, I really appreciate it. But thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.